Hi, Sean Lee here, and this is Technique Talk for Paganini Caprice number 5. The A sections of this Caprice have the big arpeggios going up with the big scales coming down, and the B section is the moto perpetuo with the famous original bowing of down, 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 up for every group of 4/16 notes. This Caprice is usually performed without that original bowing, which makes it a terrific and exciting showpiece of reasonable difficulty. But adding in that original bowing makes this Caprice virtually impossible for many people, although some people might find it to be relatively natural. Before we get into it, I do want to repeat what I say in my other video about what order to learn the Paganini Caprices in, which is that if you are a young or developing violinist with many skills that you'd like to improve on, getting stuck on this original bowing is really not a good use of your time. This original bowing is hardly ever used elsewhere in the violin repertoire, so slaving over this bowing really isn't going to benefit you very much elsewhere, and you'll get a lot more return for your time and energy if you work on other caprices. That being said, let's talk about this bowing. First, I'll share 2 tips that I got from Ruggero Ricci. The first thing he said was to make sure that the up bow in this figure doesn't have too much sudden movement. Keeping the up bows smaller in motion should help make this bowing more consistent, and I found that with the down bow ricochets, saving the bow even the tiniest bit really helped. The second tip that Mr. Ricci gave was to play this Caprice at the speed of your bow. So the idea is that every bow has a speed at which it wants to bounce. And this might vary a bit depending on where you are in the bow, but once you figure out the location in the bow where this bowing seems to work, what you want to do is play this Caprice at the tempo that matches the speed of your bow. I found this advice to be quite surprising because normally I would think of tempo as a purely musical choice, but in this case, it really helps. Now, as far as my own journey with this bowing, it was a very long and slow process. First, what I did was to get a feel for the bowing with just a single note in the left hand acting as a drone. Basically, the most simple context possible. Then I started playing the bowing with open strings where I would just stay on any given string and get used to it, then move on to the neighboring string and get used to that, and so on and so forth, just to get a feel for how the different angles in the right arm affected the bowing. Then I started playing the bowing with a scale in the left hand, but playing one note in the left hand per 4 notes in the bow. And this was just to get something moving in the left hand, but keeping it, again, really basic and simple. Then I started doing the bowing with a scale in the left hand, but playing one note in the left hand per 1 note in the bow. This was to get something moving up to speed, but still playing a very predictable and familiar pattern. By that point, I had been learning the notes of the Caprice, and I began to put it together. However, I found that it wasn't really working. I could sort of do the bowing for short passages at a time, but I found that once the string crossings got a bit more complicated, the bowing would just fall apart. So after trying it for a while, I put the Caprice away, although I did return to it several times over the next several years, but continued to plateau at that point where I could only do the bowing maybe 30 or 40% of the time. Finally, I did find a way of practicing that did get me past that plateau, and in retrospect, it's so obvious that I should have practiced this way, but it took me forever to come around to it. And the practice method that got me to the next level with this bowing was simply to play the bowing with the notes of the Caprice slowly. I know, again, looking back, it's so clear, but what can I say? The reason I didn't do that at first is because I felt that the bow stroke itself relies on the ricochet and natural bounce of the bow. Therefore, playing it slowly, I assumed wouldn't carry over because it's just a completely different bowing. However, as I practiced it slowly with the notes, I found 2 things. The first was that even doing the bowing very slowly to the point where I'm just holding the bow with the right hand and manually playing each note, there was still something about getting that basic motion in the muscle memory of which notes are down, which notes are up, and linking that to the left hand that carried over and counted for something. And when something is this difficult, anything that counts for something goes a long way. The other thing I found was that as I got closer to tempo, I could create a kind of semi-ricochet, and the way I did that was just by adding a bit of pressure to the right pinky. This meant that the pinky was carrying some of the weight of the bow, which allowed the bow to bounce a bit higher and therefore slower. It's almost like the bow is filled with helium. So once I discovered this, I was able to bridge that gap between the very slow versions and the up-to-tempo versions. I also think this technique will be useful for other places in the violin repertoire where a ricochet is necessary, but at a speed that's slower than the bow itself wants to bounce. So looking back, I wonder, if I had figured out how to practice this way earlier, would I have gotten a handle on this bowing much quicker? It's possible, probably, but anyway, that's the story of how I got to be able to sort of do this bowing. And with the A sections, the way I practice it is to turn on the metronome. That might sound a bit counterintuitive because there are no bar lines and no beats, but what I do is turn on the metronome and pretend it's playing eighth notes, and then I treat the arpeggios going up like they're sextuplets and the scales coming down like 30-second notes. So that means 3 notes per beat on the way up and 4 notes per beat on the way down. And what I do is to organize them around the beat so that I arrive at the top notes and arrive at the bottom A's on the beat. And this allows me to practice these A sections in an organized way and increase the speed in a gradual manner. When I'm performing this caprice, my focus phrase is think shape. And that has a different meaning depending on whether I'm playing the A sections or the B section. When I'm playing the A sections, think shape refers to the shape in the left hand. So I can think of the arpeggios and the scales in groups of notes rather than individual notes by thinking of the shape in the left hand for each change of position. For the B section, think shape refers to the dynamics and the musical direction. And yes, I do not want this to come out flat and boring, but the primary reason for me to think this way is actually a bit of a mind hack. I know that when I'm playing this piece up to speed, if my mind is focused on that bowing, chances are I'm going to get in my own way. So by directing my focus on dynamics and musical direction, I create in my mind an assumption and a trust that the bowing is going to work. So although when I'm practicing this caprice slowly, I might really be analyzing that bowing and thinking about it to figure out why it's not working the way it should in certain spots, as I get closer to tempo, I try to think more and more in a musical way. This creates a better frame of mind and gets me more consistent results too. So that's my experience with this caprice, and I hope that'll give you some ideas of how to work on it. When I look back and think of how much time I spent struggling with that original bowing, I think if I went back in time and knew how much time it would take me in order to learn what I did, I might have opted to just not do it. This is why my nickname for this caprice is the colossal waste of time. And now that I've wasted a lot of my own time with it, I've now wasted some of yours. However, the optimistic part of me likes to think that there's something about struggling with this bowing and having to truly examine it that taught me a lot of things about the bow that I might not have learned otherwise. And so I wish you the best of luck with this caprice. I also wish you the least amount of wasted time possible and a reminder to practice hard, but not too hard.